Namaste, and welcome to our continuing series, Essays on the Gita, with our beloved Ranga. We are on page, I have 34, but the sentence begins with, "We must remember that duty is an idea."
So we'll read the whole para and then we come back to it. The chapter is the core of the teaching. We must remember that duty is an idea which in practice rests upon social conceptions. We may extend the term beyond its proper connotation and talk of our duty to ourselves, or we may, if we like, say in a transcendent sense that it was Buddha's duty to abandon all, or even that it is the ascetic's duty to sit motionless in a cave. But this is obviously to play with words. Duty is a relative term and depends upon our relation to others. It is a father's duty as a father to nurture and educate his children. A lawyer's to do his best for his client, even if he knows him to be guilty and his defense to be a lie. A soldier's to fight and shoot to order, even if he kills his own kin and countrymen. A judge's to send the guilty to prison and hang the murderer. And so long as these positions are accepted, the duty remains clear, a practical matter of course, even when it is not a point of honor or affection, and overrides the absolute religious or moral law. But if the inner view is changed, if the lawyer is awakened to the absolute sinfulness of falsehood, the judge becomes convinced that capital punishment is a crime against humanity. The man called upon on the battlefield feels, like the conscientious objector of today, or as a Tolstoy would feel, that in no circumstances is it permissible to take human life any more than to eat human flesh. It is obvious that here the moral law, which is above all relative duties, must prevail. And that law depends on no social relation or conception of duty, but on the awakened inner perception of man, the moral being. So he has told us what duty is, where it is applicable and where it is not. Okay. The not will come a little later, where it is not applicable, but here he has spoken about duty. Duty is a convention, depending at which level of consciousness you are. Okay. As he says, it's a father's duty to educate his children. It's a soldier's duty to obey the commander. So these are duties which you have to do, provided you are at that level. So, but then he raises objections to all of them. He says, what about the judge who feels that capital punishment is wrong? What about the father who wants to lead a spiritual life? He has to go out. Then, and what about the judge? Yeah, and a soldier. If he feels that it is wrong to, like a conscientious objector. So he says it depends on it's a very, it's a limited conception of the mind. It is a social convention.
But it's very strong in the social.
It is very strong at the normal social level, and then he will talk about the standards of conduct. So it depends at which level you are. Then these things apply. Was it wrong for Buddha to give up family and a small child and go away for a spiritual life? That's a question. So we go to the next para. There are in the world, in fact, two different laws of conduct, each valid on its own plane, the rule principally dependent on external status and the rule independent of status and entirely dependent on the thought and conscience. The Gita does not teach us to subordinate the higher plane to the lower. It does not ask the awakened moral consciousness to slay itself on the altar of duty as a sacrifice and victim to the law of the social status. It calls the higher and not the lower. From the conflict of the two planes, it bids us to ascend to a supreme poise above the mainly practical, above the purely ethical, to the Brahmic consciousness. It replaces the conception of social duty by a divine obligation. The subjection to external law gives place to a certain principle of inner self-determination of action, proceeding by the soul's freedom from the tangled law of works. And this, as we shall see, the Brahmic consciousness, the soul's freedom from works and the determination of works in the nature by the Lord within and above us, is a kernel of the Gita's teaching with regard to action. So, here he has mentioned only two laws of conduct, but in synthesis, he describes three laws of conduct. So, here he is saying there is an external status and the other one is internal psychological. So, the psychological is far superior to the external. The external is a father's duty to do this, a husband's to be faithful to his wife, the wife should be faithful to the husband. These are all conventions. They are conventions. In fact, it reminds me of something interesting. The wife's faithfulness to the husband is a moral convention. Okay, so suppose you find that at a certain time there is an incompatibility, and with great amount of friendship and understanding, you part company. That's perfectly okay. There's a mother's drama on this subject, if you remember. What is the drama? What is it called? Towards the Future. She staged it on the on our in playground. So it depends entirely. There's nothing wrong. There's no anger. There is no fight. Nothing. You just see an incompatibility, and you just part company and remain friendly forever. But you are not husband and wife anymore. So this is a convention. Okay, like just like monogamy, and these are all conventions. It is largely nature that determines that. We know, for instance, that nature acts in such a way that the proportion between male and females is normally maintained at 50%. Then monogamy is a rule. Okay, but sometimes nature, due to many reasons, it becomes 49-51. Sometimes it becomes 45-55. Then a strange thing happens. Then you have what is polygamy or polyandry. So this is just nature is forcing you to take a certain action. It's a completely, you know that, na? Among the Mormons, the Germans who settled in the U.S., polygamy is very common, and among the Todas in India, the Todas are Greek descendants in the Nilgiris. It's a very strange thing how they came from there, but they are of Greek descent and they live in Tamil Nadu in the Nilgiri hills. Okay, their polyandry is common. That means to say, one wife has several husbands, maybe 2 or even 3, because the nature somehow has disturbed the balance of 50%.
As you are saying this, I'm I'm thinking of the 10 Commandments of the Christian religion.
Yeah,
That's all moral,
yeah, that's
isn't
right.
it?
Exactly. And morality is a mental standard. So I'm coming to that. So in synthesis, Srivendra describes the four standards of conduct in a very wide and general way. You can divide into so many. But the first standard of conduct is when you are not developed, you have to develop yourself. Develop yourself physically, vitally, mentally. So you have to pay a lot of attention to yourself. So the ego is valid. Depending at that level, okay, the ego is valid. Now comes a problem. So if your ego is valid and you want freedom and you want to do something which a neighbor is objecting to, the society steps in. I can't play music at midnight loudly at home. My neighbor will be disturbed. Okay. There are so many things like that that happen in particularly a large complex where there are many, many flats. This sort of problem always arises. What you are doing, the other object. Okay. So society steps in and says, thus far and no further. So social law comes in. Society tells the individual what to do, he can do and what he cannot do. There is a social law. That's entirely a convention. Entirely a convention.
So both the first and the second.
Yeah. Then you come to the third law, and that is morality and ethics. In the second law, society is telling the individual what he can do and what cannot do. But, for instance, you have to fight for your country. That's a social law. You have to undergo the training and you have to stand up for society. Now, in the third law, man imposes his understanding of truth and decency and nobility on society. So he comes out with his moral ideas. It is mentally formed and he imposes it first on himself and then he thinks that since I am a human and others are human, I can extend it to others. So then you have the moral law. Okay. It is good to help others. Okay. It is good to do charity. It is good to do this benevolence. These are all moral ideas. Then comes the last, the social, the spiritual law, which says that when you are surrendered to the divine, you have to obey only the divine, neither to your mind, nor to society, nor to anybody. You have to give up all standards and only depend on the divine. So at that level, Buddha was entirely justified in leaving his family because his call was the highest of all. So higher call always takes precedence over the lower call. That's what Swindler is going to tell us also. So it depends at which level you are in.
I'm a little confused on the third one. What about the negative side?
Like,
Well, you said, it's do good to people, be a philanthropist.
okay, yeah, I'll tell you that. It's wrong to steal. It's wrong to tell a lie. Moral ideas?
Yes, but
You
isn't
agree?
that the second?
The second one is social law.
But social law was...
There is a interconnection.
Okay.
There is an interconnection. But the social law is purely mechanical and say you can't play loudspeaker after 12 o'clock. You can't cross a red light in traffic. Just social law. Okay. Even you can't enter into a 5-star hotel wearing a vest. You have to wear, in some places, you have to wear even a tie. Okay. It's a social law. There's nothing right or wrong about it. So that's a social law. Then you have the moral law. So morality tells you can't tell a lie. It's wrong. Can't steal. It's wrong. Can't kill anybody. It's wrong. All the three examples are not applicable at the spiritual level.
The Gita.
I can steal bread if I am myself a pauper. I can steal bread to feed someone who is dying. I am doing it out of generosity. I am not doing it for myself. Then Arjuna is being asked to kill his own kin, but without anger, without hatred, without rancor. So the moral law doesn't apply. So that's a moral law. It's very good to give charity and do humanitarian work. Certainly, at the moral law, yes, valid. At the spiritual law, there may be better ways to help the poor. Even in the physical world, there are better ways. We have that famous example of give a man a fish one day, you have done a good job. But why don't you do something better? Instead of teach him fishing. You have solved his problem. So even at this moral level, there are different standards. And at the highest level, I don't want to help only one man with feeding him only one meal. I want to do something for entire society. I want to do something for entire mankind. I'll take the whole one step towards non-suffering. That is what Srimda has done. He goes to the next level of evolution, which will help everybody. But this is not obvious to everybody, but that is the truth. And that's the reason why charity is a palliative. It's a temporary cure. And that also doesn't always produce a good result. Because if you feed a poor man, next day he'll come again knocking at your door. You have created a problem for yourself. So these are all these laws they have problems and defects. So the highest is obey only the divine. He will never mislead you.
What about charity to animals?
Pardon?
Charity towards animals.
Charity.
Towards
Yeah,
animals.
Charity is okay.
To animals?
Oh, it's the same thing. It's the same thing. Because from a higher point of view, you are not solving the problem of animals. Are you solving? In Pondicherry, we have a. By the way, you know how many street dogs there are in Pondicherry? You'll be surprised. In every street, in my street, there are 10. And people come and feed them. But in Chennai, or even in Lawspate, in Pondicherry, nobody is feeding those dogs. And then what happens? They attack small children because they are hungry. They become wild animals. So, there are other solutions. They catch them and take them away. Okay, so these are all moral standards which are not always applicable. And why is it coming? Because if I have a pet dog, okay, and he gives 5 puppies, I don't know what to do with 5 puppies. I want one pet, but I don't want 5. I can't feed them. So what do? They go and leave them in the park. So are you going to solve the problem fully? You can't. So it's at its own level, it's okay. But it's not a spiritual solution. I'm not saying it's wrong. It is imperfect. That's all. There are better solutions. Don't ask me what is a better solution for street dogs. I don't know. So there are so many ways of doing things. This Remna is discussing in a very general way. Okay, the first level of self-interest, ego is valid. The second is the social law. Ego is valid only up to a certain point. The ego is not valid beyond a certain point. You can't encroach on others' territory. So social law comes in. Third law, the moral law. It's certainly better than this one. Then you go to the spiritual law. So now we'll read this, and Srimdo is telling you he is limiting it only to 2. The external physical laws and the psychological laws. Okay. There are in the world, in fact, 2 different laws of conduct, each valid in its own plane. There. It's valid in its own plane, not in another plane. The rule principally dependent on external status, the physical, okay, and the rule independent of status, entirely dependent on the thought and conscience, psychological, depends on what your thought and conscience is. The Gita does not teach us to subordinate the higher to the lower. It does not ask the awakened moral consciousness to slay itself on the altar of duty as a sacrifice and victim to the law of the social status. So, it calls us higher and not lower. So, this is what we have to see. From the conflict of the two planes, it bids us ascend to a supreme poise above the mainly practical, above the purely ethical, to the Brahmic consciousness. We'll discuss this a little bit what he says afterwards, what the Gita's position is on all this. It replaces the conception of social duty by a divine obligation. The subjection to external law gives place to a certain principle of inner self-determination of action, proceeding by the soul's freedom from the tangled law of works. And this, as we shall see, the Brahmic consciousness, the soul's freedom from works, and the determination of works in the nature by the Lord within and above us, is a kernel of the Gita's teaching with regard to action. So, he has not spelled out what he has said in the last chapter. In the last chapter, he says the Gita does not reject the physical world's actions. Whatever action you are doing, it does not reject. So it says to the ordinary man, become more generous, get rid of your ego. That's what it is. I'm using my own words. So don't be selfish, go become more, think of others also. So the man who is already at a better level, okay, they tell him, follow religion, take up a religion. To the religious man, they will tell, the Gita tells the religious man, don't limit yourself to religion only, go to spiritual law. So it's a gradation. So the Gita accepts. The normal man is being asked to do social work and help others. The social worker is asked to become more religious. And the religious man is being asked to go to the spiritual world. So this is what he tells in the last chapter. So a hint of that is here also. The higher has always got more right and predominates over the lower. So that's exactly what Arjuna is doing. If he is at the moral level, he is perfectly right in saying, I will not fight. I will not kill my own people. But there is the other aspect that God's work needs destruction of the evil. So when he is refusing to do that, he is not following God's work. So Sri Krishna tells him, fine, morality is fine, but please rise to another level of consciousness and there your moral problem will disappear. That's what he's saying. So yes, Swami is saying that exactly. He says, the Brahmi, tangled law of works, it's very complicated. In fact, in the Gita also you have the same thing, tangled works, okay? Karma. Gahana karmana gati. Gahana means deep and very complicated is works in the physical world. What type of work will you do? What should you do? What should you not do? What you should do and not do may not apply to me. So there are so many different ways. So works in the world is a very complex thing. So that's what he's saying here also. Tangled law of works. He is repeating what the Gita says. Okay. So what should you do? You should obey the self above or the psychic being within, the Lord within. The determination of works in the nature by the Lord within and above us. This is the kernel of the Gita's teaching with regard to action. So we come back to the chapter heading. The core of the teaching is do the works after identifying yourself with the self or with the psychic being. But before that, try to do the higher. Again, the idea comes up. If you are egoistic, go to social work. If you are doing socialistic work, go introduce religion into it. And if you are doing religious works, become spiritual.
So if the conscientious objector says, I will be
committing a crime if I follow what you are saying, asking me
Yes.
to do, he is fully within his rights. And society is beginning to accept that.
Yes, yes.
That's right. So already there is a better understanding of things. Otherwise, conscription is a law in most European countries. It's not like China and India. And China also there is a problem. But in India, we have such a large population that the number of applicants for entering the army is so huge that we can't take them. Okay. In China, they are forced. And that's why they don't want to fight. That's one of the weaknesses of the Chinese army. Okay. The soldiers are not willing to fight. But they are forced to. Then in Europe, the population is so small, 50 million, 30 million, 40 million, 50 million. Germany has 100 million, but France and England have about 60 million. So they have to give training to everybody and force them to do social work. Unless you are declared your health does not permit or you are not normal, then you get a certificate from the doctor, you are allowed not to do. Okay, so this is the core of the Gita's teaching. Do the higher and not the lower. That's the basic thing. And that higher and lower we have discussed. So there can be so many different types of actions. The Gita can only be understood like any other great work of the kind by studying it in its entirety and as a developing argument. But the modern interpreters, starting from the great writer Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, who first gave to the Gita this new sense of a gospel of duty, have laid an almost exclusive stress on the first 3 or 4 chapters, and in those on the idea of equality, on the expression kartavyam karma, that work which you should do. Okay? So it becomes a duty. The work that is to be done, which they render by duty, and on the phrase, thou hast a right to action, but none to the fruits of action, which is now popularly quoted as a great word, Mahavakya of the Gita. But simply saying you have to understand the whole and not only parts. Okay? The rest of the 18 chapters, with their high philosophy, are given a secondary importance, except indeed the great vision in the 11th. This is natural enough for the modern mind, which is or has been till yesterday inclined to be impatient of metaphysical subtleties and far off spiritual seekings, eager to get to work, and, like Arjuna himself, mainly concerned for a workable law of works, a dharma. But it is a wrong way to handle this scripture. Don't read too much into individual sentences or individual chapters. Read the whole thing and place the whole thing in the proper context. Then only you will understand. That's what he's saying. Okay? So, I'll quickly go through each sentence and we'll see what he's saying. Very interesting, because Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, who Sri praised so much, he's saying he has completely misinterpreted the Gita. Bankim Chandra Chatterjee was the author of the what should be the national anthem of India, Vande Mataram. It was he who did that. And he did that in a very strange way. Okay? It is half Sanskrit and half Bengali. So people were critical of him. They told him, what the hell have you done? This is neither Sanskrit nor Bengali. It is something in between. He said, you people don't understand. But one day the entire nation will be singing this song. And he turned out to be right. So, Even that Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, okay, Sri Aurobindo called him a rishi. And that's a very interesting thing, because I'm going slightly out of the subject here, but it's very interesting to see what is meant, because what is meant by a rishi? One who has a subtle sight. He is a rishi. Not what his character is. A rishi may not be a perfect human being at the normal level. He may be angry, he can get greedy, but he has the capacity of sight, subtle sight. So Sri Aurobindo called Bankim Chandra a rishi. And when Bankim Chandra went to Ramakrishna, Ramakrishna poo-pooed him. He is a very ordinary man. He is talking only of most ordinary things. He is talking of money and sex and these things. What sort of a man is he? But Sri Aurobindo is calling him a rishi. So this was big problem to me for a long time, until one day something very interesting happened in the ashram. I'll tell you that. There used to be Charupada Bhattacharya, who was Pranabda's uncle. He was the one who was responsible for bringing the whole family here to the ashram. They came in about 1942 or 1943, first time they came. And it was he who brought the whole family here. But externally, he was quite crude. Okay? I won't go into details, but he was quite crude in his ways, in his speech and all. But Nolida called him a rishi. And I found this very strange, because when Nolida is saying he is a rishi, he must be that. So then I got a proof one day of this, why he is a rishi. Okay? Then I understood what is meant by a rishi. I'll tell you. I was with Temi Ben. No, I was not in Temi. I was with Udar once in the Golconda basement having tea. He invited me to come and have tea because of something or other I've forgotten. And Charupada also was sitting there. Okay? And Temi Ben happened to come in from the garden into the basement for tea. And when she came in, he said, "You are looking like a yogini." Okay? Later on, Temi Ben told me that in that particular time when she walked in, there was a subtle, she was in a very special state of consciousness, and there was a sort of fire coming out of, subtle fire coming out of her head. And he saw that. And he called her a yogini. So he is having subtle sight. He is a rishi. Then I understood what is meant by rishi, and the contradiction between Sri Aurobindo calling Bankim Chandra a rishi and Ramakrishna calling him a most ordinary human being and even a worthless fellow is very compatible. Interesting. So, even in the Vedic period, the rishis were living at a higher level of consciousness, but the lower levels were ordinary. Durvasa used to get angry and curse. So this is what we have to understand. We have to judge always by the higher and not by the lower. In fact, Sri Aurobindo says something very interesting in the foundations of Indian culture. He says, how do you judge a culture? You must judge it not by its lowest points, nor by its average, but what it is capable of at its highest level. It is capable of that. That is what you must judge a culture by.
In his letters on poetry and art, he says, when this great soul comes down and brings poetry or brings music, he may be a coarse human being.
Yes.
Only judge what he came for.
That's right.
Not the person.
That's right. That's exactly the same principle here. So here is Arjuna, okay, shooting his own brother and killing his own brother, Karna. So somebody else who is there will say, what is this? He is killing his own kin, but he is at a higher level of consciousness. He is obeying the divine law. Okay, so So, but the modern interpreters, starting from the great writer Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, who first gave to the Gita this new sense of a gospel of duty, have laid an almost exclusive stress on the first 3 or 4 chapters, and in those on the idea of equality, on the expression kartavyam karma, which they are interpreting as duty. Whereas in the Gita, it means that work which the divine is telling you to do. That's the difference. Okay? The work that is to be done, which they render by duty, and on the phrase, thou hast a right to action, but none to the fruits of action, which is now popularly quoted as a great word, Mahavakya of the Gita. The rest of the 18 chapters, with their high philosophy, are given a secondary importance, except indeed the great vision in the 11th. This is the 11th chapter, is the vision of the Supreme. The vision of the Supreme, which Arjuna can't see, but Sri Krishna gives him the divine eye and then makes him see his own form at the highest level. There's a destruction and a construction. He is destroying all that needs to be destroyed. So it's a frightful description. We'll come to that in the 11th chapter.
So Bankim Chandra Chatterjee read that 11th chapter, I'm sure.
Okay. Then, this is natural enough for the modern mind, which is or has been until yesterday inclined to be impatient of metaphysical subtleties and far off spiritual seekings, eager to get to work, and, like Arjuna himself, mainly concerned for a workable law of works, a dharma. Give me a law in the physical world. But it is a wrong way to handle the scripture. In fact, there cannot be a practical law of works in the world applicable to everybody equally. You can't. Somebody has to do something, you have to do exactly the opposite. So it's not possible. So you have to go to the next level and act. The equality which the Gita preaches is not disinterestedness. The great command to Arjuna, given after the foundation and the main structure of the teaching, have been laid and built. Arise, slay thy enemies, enjoy a prosperous kingdom, has not the ring of an uncompromising altruism or of a white, dispassionate abnegation. It is a state of inner poise and wideness which is the foundation of spiritual freedom. With that poise, in that freedom, we have to do the work that is to be done. A phrase which the Gita uses with the greatest wideness, including in it all works, sarvakarmani, all works, and which far exceeds, though it may include social duties or ethical obligations. What is the work to be done is not to be determined by the individual choice, nor is the right to the action and the rejection of claim to the fruit the great word of the Gita, but only a preliminary word governing the first state of the disciple when he begins ascending the hill of yoga. So there you are, the hill, there's a gradation. It is practically superseded at a subsequent stage, for the Gita goes on to affirm emphatically that the man is not the doer of the action. It is Prakriti, it is nature, it is the great force with its 3 modes of action that works through him, and he must learn to see that it is not he who does the work. Therefore, the right to action is an idea which is only valid so long as we are still under the illusion of being the doer. It must necessarily disappear from the mind like the claim to the fruit as soon as we cease to be our own as soon as we cease to be, to our own consciousness, the doer of our works. All pragmatic egoism, whether of the claim to fruits or of the right to action, is then at an end. So it's a subtle thing. Now, Srimda is saying how overstressing only one aspect is not the right way. He is explaining. Very interesting, we'll read that. The equality which the Gita preaches is not disinterestedness. Okay? The great command to Arjuna, given after the foundation and main structure of the teaching has been laid and built. What's he telling him? Arise, slay thy enemies, enjoy a prosperous kingdom. If you say this to an ordinary man, he'll say, wow, I'm happy. My neighbor is a very rich man, I'll kill him and enjoy. Arise, slay thy enemy. So, this is an advice which is given to the man who is free, who is at a higher level of consciousness. So, that's exactly what you have to understand the Gita rightly. And people in the West have not understood the Gita, those who are even Indologists. There is a lady who is supposed to be a PhD in Indology. Okay, she has not understood the Gita at all. She says, I think her name is Wendy Donegal. Okay, and she says the Gita is a manual for war. Total misunderstanding. Okay, that's exactly what he's saying. After the main structure of the teaching has been laid and built, after that, arise and slay thy enemies, enjoy a prosperous kingdom. Because this also you have to see the context. Okay, so arise. Don't be in a negative state. I will not fight. No. Action is always superior to non-action. So arise, slay thy enemies who represent the evil in the world. That you have to see the context. And then enjoy a prosperous kingdom. Definitely, prosperity is better than poverty. So, this is what he is saying. Has not the ring of an uncompromising altruism. It's not an advice which a humanistic person or one who is doing philanthropic work, he will never give this advice to somebody. Okay? Or a white, dispassionate abnegation. Abnegation, deny yourself enjoyment. The ascetic says enjoyment will become impure. It will become pleasure. So don't start enjoying things. Give up enjoyment itself. The spiritual person will say, enjoy but without attachment and without desire. That's the difference. So you have to see the context how it is. Okay, he is being asked to enjoy a prosperous kingdom, but without desire and without ego, and that will not be there if you have risen to another level. That's what he's saying. Okay, it is a state of inner poise and wideness which is the foundation of spiritual freedom. It's interesting because this is also one of the questions which a very well-known anchor, TV anchor, asked Sadhguru one day. He said, I am seeing in India all the spiritual institutions are so wealthy. How come? He is asking. Because normally the idea is wealth is acquired by wrong means and you start enjoying in the wrong way. So spiritual institutions should not be wealthy. Okay, so then he challenges him and tells him that you don't object when a tennis player is getting more money than he deserves. You don't object when an actor is getting more money than he deserves. Why are you finding fault here? Because of the preconceptions. But wealth is certainly better than poverty, but not wealth with attachment, ego and desire. If these three are not there, certainly prosperity is better than poverty. In fact, in this Life Divine, in the last chapter, this question is also taken up. Okay? So, usually in India, asceticism is equated with spirituality. But that's not true. You can be equally, you can be what about, look at in India, look at the origin of all our greatest spiritual people. Buddha, he comes from a king, a family of kings. What about Krishna? What about Ram? Okay, so it is a wrong idea to think that spirituality should equal poverty and uh, simplicity. Simplicity, yes, but not simplicity with asceticism. Okay, so when he's saying enjoy a prosperous kingdom, you have to understand it in the right way. Okay, so now I come back to this one. So, with that poise, in that freedom, we have to do the work that is to be done. A phrase which the Gita uses with the greatest wideness and including in it all works, sarva karmani, and which far exceeds, though it may include, social duties and ethical obligations. So, social duties and ethical obligations are not being rejected by the divine. Krishna is not rejecting. If you are at that level, by all means do it. But if you are doing social duties only, go to a moral level. And if you are doing only moral levels, try to bring in God and try to go from a religion to spirituality. Always keep going higher and higher until finally no laws bind you down. That's the message of the Gita, the core of the teaching. So, now the question of work. What is the work to be done is not determined by the individual choice, nor is the right to the action and the rejection of claim to the fruit the great word of the Gita, but only a preliminary word governing the first state of the principle, of the disciple when he begins ascending the hill of yoga. It is applicable at the first level. You certainly have a right to demand the fruits of works if you are at an egoistic level. Because if you don't have a motive at that level, how are you going to work with enthusiasm? You won't. So motive is very useful at that level. But the moment you go to a higher level, do the work, but the motive should be offering it to the divine, not for yourself. So that's what he's saying. It is practically superseded at a subsequent stage. For the Gita goes on to affirm emphatically that the man is not the doer of the action. Now, the spiritual truth is that you are not doing any work at all. So where is the question of doing or not doing? Nature is doing through you. And when you go to the self, you realize that you are only a witness, that you are not the doer at all. This is a very big discovery in spiritual life, that you realize that you are not doing anything. It was nature which was making you do everything. Nature which has three modes of action, sattva, rajas, tamas, belonging to the body, life and mind. Your body is being directed by physical forces. Your vital is also being handled by universal prana. Your mind, thoughts are entering from the plane, universal plane of mind, entering into your mind. So it is nature which is making you dance like a puppet. But you don't realize that. There is no freedom at all. You are slave to nature. So when you go out and go to the self, the nirvana consciousness, the Brahmic consciousness, you are not identified with your body, mind, life. You realize that I was thinking, I was doing all the time, I was thinking, I was eating, I was running. Now I realize that I was not. It was a body, mind, life obeying nature. And I was only inside watching. That's what he's saying. So where does this kartavyam karma come in? There is no meaning when you realize that. That's what he's saying. The right to action. So therefore, the right to action is an idea which is only valid so long as we are under the illusion of being the doer. And when do you have the illusion of being the doer, so long as you are identified with your body-mind life. I am this. I am not the soul because I don't even know what the soul is. Then, yes, duty and all these things apply. Okay? So that's what he's saying. It must necessarily disappear from the mind like the claim to the fruit as soon as we cease to be, to our own consciousness, the doer of our works. All pragmatic egoism, whether of the claim to works or of the right to action, is then at an end. So don't take this one thing, this one sentence, in its unconnected with the rest. That's what he's saying. The Gita has to be read in entirety, and then you put the right stress on each one in its proper context. That's what he's saying.
Thank you, Ranga. Namaste all.